Okay, we are back with another set of lectures. We have two topics from the course and exam description. We have 1.4 and 1.5. We're going to talk about Columbian exchange and also about labor systems. So to begin, the Columbian exchange, the Spanish exploration and conquest, we're going to be focusing on geography and the environment, how all those things are interacting with each other. The learning objective for this topic says explain causes of the Columbian exchange and its effect on Europe and the Americas during the period after 1492. So we're going to start with this key concept. It says the Columbian exchange brought new crops to Europe from the Americas, stimulating European population growth and new sources of mineral wealth, which facilitated the European shift from feudalism to capitalism. So we're going to start here with the population growth. The crops that Europeans and the Spanish particularly found in the New World, we talked about before, were corn, squash, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, avocados, all of these foods that are very nutritious and are able to grow plentifully in a small plot of land are now being exported back to Europe, which in turn helps feed Europeans, helps them live longer, helps them have more kids, and so therefore the population in Europe begins to increase. You can see on the chart on the bottom right that the European estimated population from 1500 to 1600 nearly doubles. So the nutritional value of this food cannot be overestimated. As far as the population growth in other parts of the Old World, in Africa, the population continued to increase also because of the crops that were being brought over from the New World, and it helps to offset the population that was being lost to enslaved labor. Going on to the second part of this key concept, we're talking about the shift from feudalism to capitalism. We've touched on this before, but the mineral wealth that was found in the form of gold and silver in Mesoamerica, that's Mexico, where the conquistadors found silver, and in South America, around the old Inca Empire, where they found gold, helps fuel a market economy. And this is not just in Spain, but also in other parts of Europe like England. So the gold and the silver get turned into coins, and then the coins are then able to be used to purchase goods or to be deposited in banks and then given as loans. That's what leads to a market economy. Well, if the English have not yet started their exploration into the New World, how is it that the English are benefiting from this? Well, by the 1500s, British sea dogs, these are essentially pirates, start to raid Spanish ships and steal some of these Spanish golden and silver coins. And that's going to lead to a market economy in England as well. Our next key concept here, other things that affected the Columbian exchange, is going to be the improvements in technology. So the organized methods for conducting international trade, such as joint stock companies, they help drive changes to the economies in Europe and the Americas. So some of these maritime technologies is the development of the caravel, which was developed by the Portuguese. You can see that the sails that the caravel has are placed in a very extreme angle, and that you have three sails here that look like three right triangles, which allow it to sail more directly into the wind without being blown off course. The compass, as you can see on the top right, was most likely borrowed from the Middle Eastern empires, and then on the bottom right, you see a sextant. And the sextant was a maritime tool that was used to locate your exact position on the Earth using the stars and geometry. So these are all the things that helped the travel be done. So like the actual logistics of the travel. Then joint stock companies were a new way to fund the exploration. So they're still necessary in increasing the amount of travel between the old world and the new world. And it's much more important on the side of funding these explorations. The English are going to be the ones that are relying mostly on these joint stock companies. The first permanent English settlement, Jamestown, will be established by the Virginia Joint Stock Company. Our next key concept says Spanish exploration and conquest of the Americas were accompanied and furthered by widespread deadly epidemics that devastated native populations by the introduction of crops and animals not found in the Americas. And so we're going to get to the diseases first, but just to kind of give you more context, by the mid 1500s, the Spanish have already toppled the two largest empires in the New World. Those are the Aztecs and the Incas. Hernan Cortes on the top left here is the one who toppled the Aztec Empire, and then Francisco Pizarro on the top right is the one that toppled the Incas. Cortes had the help of the Aztec rivals. So the Aztecs had some enemy native tribes surrounding them, and once the Spanish landed in the New World, they were able to band together against the Aztecs. Additionally, Cortes would have never been able to do this had he not had someone to act as his translator. So Malinche is the name of his translator that the Spanish conquistadors used to gain access to Tenochtitlan. Once they were in Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs tried to fight back. The night in which they tried to repel the Spanish out of the city is called Noche Triste. That translates in Spanish to sad night because it did not turn out well for the Aztecs. The Spanish began to siege the city, and it ended with the Aztecs surrendering. So the Spanish end up changing the landscape once they bring the Aztecs into submission. You can see in the picture up here in the top, you see a cathedral. This is the center of Mexico City. The cathedral that you see up here is built on top of the very same location as the old temple in the center of Tenochtitlan. So they tore down the temple, and then they used the same stone, the same building materials to build a church. Exploration and settlement of California and other parts of North America would continue until the 1700s. You'll start to see the start of the mission system that was started by Junipero Serra. He will establish the missions all across the California coast in the 1700s. All right, so now crops that were coming to the New World from the Old World that were having an impact. So sugar, and that's one of the big important crops, and then the livestock that was coming over was pigs, cattle, and horses. They were introduced to America. So some of these had very negative environmental impacts. The pigs and the cattle, they would sometimes be left out, and or they would escape their pens, and they would be let loose, and they would essentially act as invasive species because they had no native predators, and so they would go out and decimate the local flora and fauna. Horses, as you see here on the bottom, were adopted by some Great Plains Indians, the Comanche, the Apache, and the Sioux. They began to use horses to go out and hunt buffalo. So they were already hunting buffalo before they had access to horses, but now they were even better able to carry out these buffalo hunts. Up next is we're talking about disease. So some of the diseases that were brought over, like smallpox and measles, we've said that the Aztecs and the other natives did not have natural immunities, and anthropologists estimate that it decimated the New World population by as much as 90% of what it was before Europeans got there. So in the previous lecture, we said that there were an estimated 54 million, or as high as 54 million people in the New World before European contact. And so after European contact, say 100, 150 years after, they were down to about 5.4 million people. And the disease that the Europeans brought sometimes traveled faster than the Europeans' actual physical location, because the diseases didn't have to be spread by the Europeans themselves. They could infect people who were natives, and then those natives would go further inland following traditional trade routes, infecting people who had never even laid eyes on Europeans. So one of the most famous stories of this is that when the Mayflower landed in 1620 in Plymouth Rock, they encountered what they described as a wilderness because the people who had been living there had perished of disease decades before, when in fact, before they had actually gotten there, that was a pretty densely populated area. So the epidemics really hurt their ability to fend off the Spanish conquistadors. All right, moving on to topic 1.5, we're talking about labor, slavery, and caste in the Spanish colonial system. So this theme is social structures, is how societies organize themselves around certain hierarchies. And the learning objective is to explain how the growth of the Spanish Empire in North America shaped the development of social and economic structures over time. So the first labor structure that we're talking about is the Encomienda system, and it's defined pretty well in the key concept here. In the Encomienda system, Spanish colonial economies marshaled Native American labor to support plantation-based agriculture and extract precious metals and other resources. So this was essentially coerced labor. The Spanish crown would grant settlers and conquistadors land and labor if they promised to convert the natives that would be living on their encomienda. There were debates over the ethics of this within the Catholic Church. You have two people or two priests within the Catholic Church advocating for opposing viewpoints. Bartolomé de las Casas was advocating for the end of the encomienda system, saying that it was unethical, that the natives that he had encountered were human and had the capacity to be converted to Catholicism and Christianity, and so therefore should not be enslaved. Meanwhile, Juan Guinness de Sepulveda, he believed the opposite. He thought that natives in the New World were savages and they did not have the capacity to accept God or to convert, so therefore it was okay if they were going to be enslaved in such a way. Eventually, Bartolomé de las Casas wins this debate within the Catholic Church, and the encomienda system will come to an end, but not without many Native Americans dying within the system. So to clear up the pictures here, on the bottom right, you see Bartolomé de las Casas in the picture. In the middle bottom is Juan Guinness de Sepulveda. All right, so European traders, they partnered with some West African groups who practiced slavery to forcibly extract slave labor for the Americas. The Spanish imported enslaved Africans to labor in plantation, agriculture, and mining. So the Spanish ran into two problems. The first one was that they could no longer coerce labor from Native Americans because the Catholic Church had said that that was wrong and that they could no longer do it. The second problem that they ran into was that the natives who they had coerced into enslaved labor were dying too quickly because, again, they did not have immunities against some of the diseases that the Europeans were carrying. And so this is where enslaved African labor really began to increase. The Portuguese were really leading the enslaved African labor or enslaved African trade at the time. They would send enslaved people from West Africa into the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is where you would see most of these sugar plantations that required quite a lot of work, and they would be doing all of this very strenuous work in tropical hot temperatures that really brought down the life expectancy of those who worked on the plantations. And so they were treated as human chattel. The word chattel means property. And because they continued to die on these plantations under harsh working conditions, the importation of human chattel continued all the way through the 1800s, and ultimately 12.5 million people were transported in boats such as this one on the bottom right, in which people would be packed shoulder to shoulder in various levels to try and get them to be enslaved labor in the New World. All right, other social structures that we saw was the development of a caste system. So the Spanish developed a caste system that incorporated and carefully defined the status of the diverse populations of Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans in their empire. So because the conquistadors, when they came to the New World, traveled in mostly male-dominated groups, they began to intermarry with the native populations. So Spanish men and Indian women or American Indian women would intermarry, and their offspring would be an ethnic mixture that now, according to the Spanish, had to be defined. And based on your ethnicity and your ancestry, you would have certain privileges within society. So the overall generic term for a person who comes from Spanish and American Indian ancestry is a mestizo. Um, the combinations of intermarriage became so complicated that the Spanish would draw these large charts, like the one that you see here on the slide, to try and determine and solidify um, who was in which caste and what intermarriage yielded which caste. And so as far as you go down this chart, it gets more and more complicated. And they really start to come up with names or just make up names randomly because there are so many different mixtures. But at the very top of this caste system, we're going to be the Peninsulares. They are the people who are Spanish and they are born in the Spanish Peninsula. Then below them are going to be the Creoles. These are people who have full Spanish ancestry, but they have been born in the New World. Below the Creoles are going to be all of the different mixtures of the castas, and then below them are going to be the full-blooded enslaved Africans and Native Americans. And so to give you an idea of what these castas were like, here are some of the pictures that are now blown up. You see the first one is the Spanish with an American Indian woman. That's the first one on the painting. And then number 7 here that's blown up, it says Chino con India. And so Chino was a derogatory term for someone who was of mixed Indian and Black ancestry. The reason why they called them Chino was because their hair would normally be curly, like the tail of a pig. And so Chino is actually short for the Spanish word cochino. So this is a derogatory term that was developed to name this caste. As you go further down, at the very bottom right, this is where the names start to get ridiculous and they start to just try to come up with whatever they can. The man on the left is labeled as a no te entiendo, which in Spanish translates to I don't know you, I don't understand you. Because their ancestry had been so mixed that it was indistinguishable. They couldn't really tell what they were. And then if no te entiendo married with an India, their offspring would be what's called a torna atrás. And torna atrás in Spanish would translate to like look behind you. So the caste system, putting people on this hierarchical system, this should go without saying, is very inappropriate, but it also speaks to the fluidity of ethnic and race relations in the New World, in the Spanish Empire, because the fact that we have a caste system like this shows that there is mobility up and mostly down, but also up based on intermarriage. It shows that intermarriage was not something that was outlawed, which is going to be something that's completely different when we get into the English colonies, where intermarriage between two different races is actually going to be denied by law. All right, so a quick recap. You have to remember the effects of the New World crops and mineral wealth on Europe, the effects of new technology like the caravel, sextant, and compass, and what that did to increase the Columbian exchange, the Old World diseases decimating the native populations, the Encomienda system and how it awarded land and coerced labor in exchange for missionary work, and the rise of enslaved labor and African slave trade that was led by the Portuguese, and finally, what the Spanish caste system meant for Spanish society, what that said about the social structures that they created in the New World. So that is it for today. We have just 2 more videos left for period 1, and I will see you on the next one.